Thank you very much, Chair. We have just commemorated the horrors of Rana Plaza, the hundreds of victims, many of whom had not wanted to go into the building but were threatened and made to pay with their lives. A disaster that tragically could have been avoided. Rana Plaza is not the only disaster linked to corporate greed, or the only disaster linked to companies misbehaving and turning a blind eye. Saida Khatoon died last December and in her lifetime never had justice for her son who died in a burning clothing factory in Bangladesh. Fire escapes were blocked. The factory in question made jeans for a known German brand. Or Rosita Tekwari, Veronica Manimbu, who are still fighting for justice after their homes were destroyed by a palm oil company in West Papua financed with European money. Injustice, impunity that makes your stomach turn. These are examples that show the need for rules on responsible business, because we are talking about daily occurrences of injuries, pollution, corruption on the other side of the world as well as in Europe. And tragically, nobody is ever to blame. Everybody points to someone else. Companies say it wasn't them, it was their supplier. They didn't know. Low prices are very welcome. Responsibility is not. But we're not talking about all companies. Let's be very clear about that. Many companies and sectors have taken action voluntarily, especially after Rana Plaza, and yet it hasn't been enough for true change. Action has been too patchy, and there's often too little justice for victims. So for victims, the case for this law is very, very clear. But for businesses, this law is of vital importance also. Why? Because they need certainty about what to do, as well as the certainty that their competitors are doing the same. As for consumers, they in themselves cannot change the world, even if it were possible for people to check every company and every label that won't make enough of a difference. And that's why we're making a law on what responsible business means. What we have before us is a political agreement that I am very proud of. It was painstakingly negotiated over 3 years, and it tries to take into account every difficulty that was raised by everyone who will be affected by this law, workers and companies alike. It has always been my aim to negotiate a position with cross-party support in this House, which is proportionate and workable for business and effective and accessible for victims. Why? Because this legislation is too important for us not to deliver. This is about what kind of Europe we want to live in and what we as Europeans value. It's about what kind of trade we want in the future, how we see globalization, and about defining our relationship with China. It's about serious action on sustainability and climate, and if we don't take a firm stand in Europe, then who will? Our task in a united Parliament is to set global standards, as we have done in the past. Een betere wereld begint bij jezelf. Ik vond die reclame...
Charity starts at home. I think that's a good idea. Because it is not true. You and I know that we can't change the world as individuals. The strongest shoulders have to bear the heaviest burden. And a better world starts with better companies. That's better for everybody who's standing in a shop and wondering which clothes they should buy. Because there should be an obligation. People have to take this seriously. Those companies will be supported if we adopt these rules. But the companies who ignore the rules and abuse the situation have to be stopped in their path. We can see that the thousands of people who died, workers in Qatar during the World Cup, building stadia, and we know that the natural reserves, such as in Indonesia, there are forests being pulled down to build pipelines. So we have to have responsible companies, and to do that we have to have European legislation. Many companies are asking themselves for clearer rules that should apply across Europe. At the moment this is falling on deaf ears, however, in the right. The right in this Parliament are talking about all sorts of right of establishment and the red tape that companies have to put up with. But, you know, there are other people who are suffering, and there are other ways of addressing this. And I think political games is really not where we should be now. Let us assume political responsibility tomorrow as Europeans, as a European Parliament. Let us take a serious step tomorrow for a more sustainable and a fairer world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now turning to Portuguese.
So, having heard from the rapporteur, we now move on to the speakers representing the committees that were a part of this process, and we'll start with the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Glucksmann has the floor.
Chers collègues,
ladies and gentlemen, this is a pregnancy test, and I found a letter in here. It was a Chinese worker asking for help, someone producing something that is then sold in a French chemist. So this is the irresponsible pyramid of globalization, a world without rules, where those who hold the most power also have the least responsibility. Zara, Nike and Shine. And the moment has come to make sure that multinational companies are held accountable. We're talking about human rights violations in the value chain. The time has come to make sure they stop hiding behind their supplier, subcontractor or branch. This due diligence act is extremely important. To try and water it down or to reject it flies in the face of our principles and our interests. Each and every one of us, ladies and gentlemen, will have to pay for this when it comes to the vote. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Próxima intervenção.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on behalf of the International Trade Committee, the Intercommittee, is Barry Andrews.
Dear colleagues, all companies carry out due diligence on their supply chains, but only insofar as it impacts the operations of their own company. What makes this proposal radical is that for the first time, companies will be mandated to carry out due diligence on their supply chain as it affects the planet, as it affects human rights abuses. This has been an extremely divisive text, but I want to set the record straight. Contrary to what you might hear from this, in this hemicycle today, SMEs are excluded from the proposal. Contrary to what you might hear today, this is not a regulatory burden. There are already supply chain laws in EU member states, so this is deregulatory, in effect, by creating a level playing field. It is also aligned with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and therefore companies not only know what they have to report, but they also know what they have to do. So this provides businesses with the opportunity to take advantage of the European Green Deal. It also gives citizens, for the first time, a very clear choice. It takes human rights and environmental degradation out of our shopping baskets. Thank you very much.
Now, on behalf of Econ, René Rapazzi has the floor.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Money moves the world, a world in which companies are hardly impressed by underemployed competition authorities in countries or complaints before the courts that are very difficult to prove. No, in this world, all they're scared of is that people will turn the tap off to stop their flow of money if people start complaining about human rights and the environment in their supply chains. This is the possibility that exists for Council. But the right doesn't want to close this tap, and the Council doesn't either. People who've made big profits, ladies and gentlemen, has the damn duty to make sure that these profits go to protect human rights and the environment. So the people who are absent, the right, I can just appeal to them, come back to the good side. It is not too late yet.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And now, on behalf of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, Senora Rafaela has the floor.
I hope that the European Parliament tomorrow will assume its responsibility. It's a great shame to see over recent days that certain colleagues, most notably from the right in this chamber, have been trying to find a coalition to table amendments that goes completely contrary to the essence of this new and important piece of legislation. I'd like to thank the rapporteur, a very good job that's been done. It's no excuse that the EMPL committee wanted to go a lot further, and if I had a say in this, then there would have been a question of responsibility for all companies, regardless of their size, when it comes to human rights and the environment. It's a good deal because it doesn't matter how big the administrative pressure is. Human rights cannot be subjugated. But it's no time to be dogmatic. We need to push on through. We need to finally give companies the possibility to assume international responsibility pursuant to the OECD guidelines. We're going to push on with this because we want to look at products that are made from forced labour. They have to be removed from our markets. Economy is driven by people, made by people. So first and foremost, that is what we're doing this for as well, for people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on behalf of the Environment Committee is Timo Vulcan.
President, thank you very much. Commissioner, thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, what right do we have in the European Union to consume products that are produced in parts of the world where human rights are being abused, the environment is being destroyed, or actually people are being exploited? What right do we have to do that? We don't have a right to do that at all. Hence, it is essential that we have a strong supply chain law that applies not just to the EU and stops at its borders, but it has global application. And with this CSDD that we'll be looking at adopting tomorrow, we have an opportunity to make sure we're not using double standards, but we are in fact making sure that human rights and environmental standards are applied across the world in the same way. And I certainly hope that the EPP will agree to this law tomorrow, and we're not adopt a compromise that will make sure that human rights and the environment would not be protected. There should be a fair approach for everybody concerned, including the companies, the environment, human rights and the workers, and that's why we have to send this common signal tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now like to pass the floor to the European Commission, namely to Didier Reynders. Commissioner, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président,
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the European Parliament, I'm particularly happy to be having this debate with you today on the draft report of your European Parliament on corporate sustainability due diligence. The Commission welcomes the work that's been done by the Legal Affairs Committee, as well as the interest of the European Parliament in the legislative proposal that was presented by the Commission in February of last year, which is a common political priority. I would like in particular to express my thanks to the rapporteur, Madame Lau Wolters, as well as the shadow rapporteurs for this file. We've had the opportunity on numerous occasions throughout the whole of this process to have exchanges of views in a particularly constructive atmosphere. We share the ambition to have cross-cutting legislative action at European Union level so that we can genuinely implement the goals of the EU in terms of the transition to a fairer, more sustainable approach towards company law.
Opportunity for the Union. This legislation can have an important impact on the way companies operate globally. It can lead to the development of new, more sustainable business models by large companies operating in the European Union market. Many stakeholders are asking for this: consumers, investors, employees, and the wider public, as well as many companies themselves. Indeed, this is an initiative where we want companies to be on board. We are ready to continue to work together with them to make due diligence a reality on the ground. In order to achieve our goals, we proposed harmonised and mandatory rules on corporate due diligence and directors' duties. Existing international recommendations and voluntary schemes have played an important role so far, but they have not been sufficient to lead to the necessary changes and to ensure a level playing field throughout the whole economy. With this proposal, we can indeed offer legal certainty and a level playing field for companies across the European Union, support for SMEs, better access to finance and guidance to facilitate the transition. This proposal aims to support companies in running their business in a way that effectively addresses possible negative impacts on human rights and the environment throughout their value chains. A review of more than 2,000 studies shows that integrating human rights and environmental protection into business operations leads to competitive advantages in all sectors of the economy and to more innovation. So, our main objective is to ensure that long-term perspectives and sustainability factors are better integrated in corporate strategies and decision-making. Therefore, in our view, a clarification of the director's duty of care is also useful. The duty of care of directors is already present in all the legal systems of our member states. The Commission's proposal does not set a new duty of care, but only clarifies duties already present in national law to make sure that directors are empowered to act also with regard to the long term. It is important to make sure that sustainability considerations are taken into account in the major decisions of large companies. The proposal does not change the existing enforcement regime in this regard. Only shareholders will be able to hold directors to account. As regards climate change, in our proposal, we provided for a special regime that would require large companies to adopt a climate transition plan to ensure that their business model and strategy are compatible with the objective to limit global warming to 1.5 in line with the Paris Agreement. The Commission changed to be covered by the whole due diligence regime. And of course, the Commission did not propose, to change to be covered by the whole due diligence regime. So there are two systems, one with the due diligence process for harms to the environment and violation of human rights, and a transition plan for climate. Ladies and gentlemen, the Commission proposed that the new rules apply only to large companies, which have the capacity to implement the measures needed and notably to scrutinise their value chains. SMEs don't fall under the scope of the proposed directive and would therefore be excluded of the administrative and civil liability regimes contemplated in terms of enforcement. To limit the impact of this proposal on SMEs across value chains, the Commission also proposed to provide them with technical and financial support. Notably, SMEs should benefit from specific guidance and tools. In a nutshell, our approach when designing the proposal has therefore been guided by the need to ensure proportionality, being mindful of impacts on competitiveness, while at the same time ensuring that we trigger a solid change on more sustainable value chains. I would like to conclude by praising again your work and commitment on this file. With this report, we are making further progress in this important field, it is a good indicator that we should be able to reach a final agreement soon. I'm now looking forward to the upcoming trilogues. I thank you, of course, for your attention, and if it's possible to go further tomorrow, we'll start very fast the trilogue. But before that, I will now listen with interest to your interventions. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Sr.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We'll now hear from two further committees. First of all, the Development Committee. Ilan de Basso has the floor.
Thank you, President. We're due to vote on a piece of legislation that is breaking new ground so that companies will be forced to take into account human rights and the environment. It shouldn't really be breaking new ground in the 21st century. Companies that work in developing countries have to respect human rights, the environment, and the principle of the rule of law, especially if we are to achieve the goals for the UN 2030. It's not the size of the company, it's the size of the damage that is done by the company that is essential. So more companies should be covered by this legislation. The trade unions' influence is of central importance to strengthen this legislation. We need more efficient, more effective and proportionate sanctions for companies who violate human rights and damage the environment. Now it is important that we get this done and dusted to generate a future in which human rights and the environment are protected and those who abuse that are held to account for their actions. Thank you, President.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker, on behalf of the Internal Market Committee, is Madam Clune.
We need to support and to enable business to act more sustainably and responsibly in their global and their EU activities, and this proposal is a step towards doing that, while also bringing legal certainty and a level playing field when compared to the existing situation where there is a varying degree of approaches taken across the Member States. Products and services that are the result of human rights and environmental violations should not be allowed on the European market. The EU is capable of setting high standards and having a strong influence on global supply chains, and we can use this influence to address human rights violations and breaches of social and environmental standards. And I was concerned that the proposed directive takes a minimum harmonisation approach because it leaves room for Member States to impose diverging obligations from those in this directive that may actually undermine legal certainty and that creation of that level playing field. So the improved text with a dedicated article to fully harmonise the provision of this directive during its transposition, and thereafter there will be a revision of 6 years to assess whether it should be turned into a regulation, is an improvement, and it will lead to an increase of harmonisation and cross-border cooperation. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Now let's move on to the speakers on behalf of the political groups, starting with the EPP. Axel Voss has the floor.
So, verehrter Herr Vorsitzender.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, especially from the jury working group, I would like to express a vote of thanks to the cooperation we had that showed always respect to each other. Even if we had differing opinions, we managed to achieve compromises. This is a very political topic, even within the EPP, and this is why it hasn't been straightforward for us. We've reached a stage now where we are saying we have to look at red tape. We have to stop red tape for companies and, of course, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. And in doing this, we have to take into account reality, the reality we see at the moment, be it COVID, be it the Russian war of aggression, be it the expansion of China. And this is why it's a very difficult environment to move in. And originally, I would have hoped that the Commission had come up with a better proposal that was more balanced. What we lay store by is full harmonisation. Companies need to have a single market within which they can work, rather than leaving this up to the member states. So I would have hoped for a little bit more ambition, a bit more innovative approach to pushing this forward, although what we have may be enough. The sectoral initiatives that we've agreed on is where I harbour hopes that at least can see more harmonisation coming down the road. What's important for me is the risk-based approach, whereby we can focus on those areas or those parts of the value chain or supply chain where risks genuinely exist, rather than just doing something blindly. Of course, what's always important for us is to look at red tape and keep that to a minimum. And I still believe that if we were to try and coddle the companies more and they feel obliged to achieve the goals, that would be a better approach rather than impose goals on them. But the compromises are there. I think it provides a good basis on which to work. Not everything on the table is something that I'm happy with or my group is happy with, and I hope that maybe we can get a few improvements through the trialogue process to help companies and to reduce red tape. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the S&D Group, the next speaker is Vice President Madam Regner.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. I think you've put a lot of effort into this file. EU CSDD constitutes a unique opportunity, an opportunity to explain to companies exactly what the rules we expect of them to achieve and what is feasible for them. It's an opportunity to help consumers so that they are relieved of the obligation, if they're in the supermarket or in a shop, that they don't know which product they can buy with a clear conscience. It's a unique opportunity to make sure that each and every product available in our internal market is produced in harmony with human rights and the environment. For the CSDD, it's a question of transparency, it's a question of including the trade unions and the NGOs, it's about the respect of human rights and social rights, it's about protecting the environment. And we cannot afford to miss this unique opportunity.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Renew Group, the next speaker is Adrián Vázquez-Lázara.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. A little bit over 1 month ago, we had the tragic anniversary of the 10 years of the Rana Plaza collapse that claimed the lives of more than 1,100 people and injured 2,500 people. We knew that we could have avoided it and we should have avoided that. People spotted cracks, structural cracks, and they shouldn't have let the workers go back the next day. This tragedy is even more serious, but it should be important for us to make sure that we pass new laws that give rights to workers and protects our planet. Tomorrow we're going to be voting on the CSDD, legislation that makes sure that economic development and social progress are more compatible with protecting individual rights and the environment. This is a balanced text. It's taken hours and hours of negotiations to cobble it together, and it's balanced because we've got freedom, economic freedom and growth with responsibility and accountability, because one without the other is unfair and the other way around it would be unbearable. So that is why I call on all political groups to support this directive. It's going to be a milestone, a landmark in this Parliament's term, but also in the future, for the future of the EU. Let us be firm so no one can say that this House didn't do everything it could to make it possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on behalf of the Greens is Vice President Heidi Hautala.
Dear President, Commissioner, colleagues,
Since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights over 10 years ago, many businesses have worked hard to ensure that their activities are not linked to human rights violations or environmental destruction. European consumers and investors expect nothing less. Nevertheless, too many companies still act as free riders and gain unfair competitive advantage from irresponsible business activity. The agreement that has now been reached in the Legal Affairs Committee offers to level the playing field. It is a balanced compromise, well aligned with widely accepted international standards. A key feature is access to justice. Without access to justice, the directive would end up as a paper tiger. Victims of human rights abuses linked to corporate activities must have the right to seek justice and to hold companies accountable for dodging their obligations. Now, the world is keenly watching what we decide here tomorrow. Yet, another Brussels moment could be at hand. As one of the world's largest markets, the EU can be a force for good in clearly defining the responsibilities of companies to respect human rights and protect the environment. It should be noted that many developing countries producing goods destined for the EU market will need support in adapting to this legislation. Luckily, the EU has several avenues available, ranging from development cooperation to partnerships, and integrating responsible business conduct into different instruments and dialogues. This legislation is not about soothing the conscience of European consumers. It is about promoting the core values of our Union and responding effectively to global environmental and human rights challenges. We must now seize this opportunity to leverage the power of business to strengthen the respect for human rights and to fight environmental destruction throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Next speaker on behalf of the ECR is Mr. Bouchardé. Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, Rapporteur. We really are seeing an idea of common sense with the CSDD, violations of human rights. Police and judges should be judging them, not by putting more burdens and cost on companies. The only consequence of this is that the companies and workers of Europe are going to be poorer, less competitive. And now we've got European companies. In the future, they'll all be American or Chinese. If we stop subcontracting by European companies outside of the EU, that's one thing. And yet, we're financing irrigation plants in third countries. We're signing trade agreements with third countries. Look in a mirror. You're trying to turn companies into agents of the 2030 agenda. You're playing with the lives and the money of those outside of Europe. Companies should be creating jobs, growth and prosperity. But in July, in Spain, hopefully we will be following the path of Sweden, Hungary, Poland, and a new Europe made up of free nations will have a resurgence. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Next speaker on behalf of the ID is Gilles Le Breton.
Chers collègues,
Ladies and gentlemen, the idea of obliging companies to make sure that their partners respect the environment and human rights throughout the supply chain is very appealing. It is in line with the ambitious goal of making capitalism more ethical. But of course, this burdens company with more red tape, and so we must take this path very cautiously before we make sure we're not going to destabilize whole swathes of the European economy. Yes, we have certain safeguards, for example, excluding SMEs that will only have to have this due diligence obligation on a voluntary basis, or the fact that this will apply to non-EU big companies that trade in Europe. But there are environmental obligations, and then there's the issue of the supply chain that we have to take into account. This isn't just about direct trade relations. All these uncertainties mean that business won't have an acceptable legal certainty, and that is why I don't support this text. Thank you.
Dou agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. Next speaker on behalf of the Left Group is Manon Aubry.
Chers collègues,
Dear colleagues, I'm speaking to you very emotionally about a major victory against multinationals' impunity, a victory for human rights, for the environment, where the multinationals will no longer be able to undermine it without being held responsible before the courts. That is a victory for the 100,000 people expropriated by Total in Uganda, for the 5,600 workers that died in Qatar for the World Cup, or those that are being exploited by Shine and Zara outside of Europe. It's a victory for all of those victims who finally can have access to justice without the multinationals hiding behind their subcontractors or their subsidiaries. A victory, it has to be said, dear colleagues, that we tore away from the lobbies, the lies, to protect the ridiculous profits they make, to the detriment of workers and the environment. We have fought for years in Brussels to ensure that these crimes are no longer unpunished. Today, for once, here in the European Parliament then, the people power has proven to actually take primacy over the interests of money. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Dou agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to pass the floor to individual members. Mr. Stefanek, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Responsible business making is important not only for job creation, but also as a whole society through its example. Many companies started to follow the principle of responsible business making based on their own decisions. I believe that responsible entrepreneurship cannot be enforced through administration or new rules, regulations, because we cannot enforce respect for human rights by increasing bureaucracy, which already is a huge burden for our SMEs. Legislation should be clearly defining which areas are truly risky. Companies cannot be financially responsible for damages they do not have any impact on, or replace the role of states. The main basis for success must be clearly defined roles, responsibilities, as well as the scope of this legislation. Without such modifications, it will only become a difficult to implement tool and an obstacle to responsible business making rather than its support.
Mr. Stefanek, you've got a blue card, so I wonder if you want to answer. It's by Madame Aubry. You can take the podium, yeah.
merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, President.
Is it okay? Yeah. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stefanek. I listened to you very carefully, and you say that companies cannot be held accountable throughout their whole supply chain. But do you agree that businesses know their supply chains when it comes to profits? When it comes to raking the money in, they can find the cheapest labor and the cheapest factory. So they're okay with raking in the profits and making sure that it finds its way to them, but not when it comes to human rights. So why are you going to vote against the text?
Thank you for this question. I shall vote against this text because this is going over and above the original proposal from the European Commission. And if you ask me whether companies know everything about their partners, suppliers, of course they know a lot about them, but cannot be held responsible for everything their suppliers do. Investors, for instance, investing in Europe, are telling us that they cannot simply control every single supplier or business partner that supplies them every single detail for their product. This will just put a burden on our companies, and I believe, based on my personal experience, that responsible business making is really an honor. And those companies that we have in Europe, a large majority of them, they are really proud of being responsible, socially responsible, but we cannot enforce this in an administrative way. Responsible business making really has to come naturally, and by putting these rules and regulations, we are putting at a disadvantage our companies, especially those small and medium-sized companies that are the backbone of our economy.
Thank you very much. I recall that in this blue card procedure, it is supposed to be 30 seconds for the question and 30 seconds for the answer. Try to stick to the allocated time. Now I give the floor to Marek Belka. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. When the Rana Plaza building collapsed 10 years ago, a similar burden fell on our European hearts and minds, subsiding to the charm of shopping cheaply for clothing made in Bangladesh. We forgot that behind the low price that we see are human tragedies, children working, or devastated environments. In a normal world, we would expect the customers to know about where the products they buy come from. Unfortunately, some corporations, including Polish ones, are improving the working conditions, but others do agree to slave work by Uyghurs or devastating environment. That is why we have to support the introducing of this directive and Lara Voters' report, because it imposes the obligation for due diligence on human rights and workers' rights and environmental protection. So the memory of the victims of the Rana Plaza tragedy obliges us to do so. So I call on all my Polish colleagues to support the draft developed in the URI Committee without any amendments. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Catherine Che, 1 minute.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, our smartphones, the devices we carry in our pockets, often contain minerals that finance bloody civil wars. 20% of the global wool production originates from Xinjiang province, where evidence clearly shows that Uyghur forced labor fuels the industry. Soybeans used in industrial cattle farming are directly linked to the destruction of the Amazon. And you know, over the last couple of months, I've heard so many colleagues, so many lawmakers, and I have to say sorry, but particularly from the right, dismissing these concerns that, yes, it happens in distant places, this is not really our business. Well, I'm sorry to say, but this is literally our business. At its core, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive focuses on the footprint our European companies leave on human rights and the environment wherever they may operate in the world. And we want our companies to be the agents of positive change. Should they cause harm, it is also our responsibility to hold them accountable, here in European courts. So the European Parliament has made crucial improvements to the Commission's proposal, and it is very important to stick to them. The time for progress is now. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Marie Toussaint, 1 minute.
Chers collègues, ladies and gentlemen, the situation is straightforward. If businesses don't respect the Paris Accord, then we won't be able to rein in global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Let us be honest, none of the petrochemicals possible, whether any or Repsol, Total, are on the right path. It's pretty straightforward. If businesses still depend on plastics or forever chemicals, then we won't be able to protect the forests of the world, the Himalayas and other areas from this pollution that makes our planet toxic. So if we don't manage to make sure that the economy works within the limits of our planets, we're continuing to make it impossible to continue living on planet Earth. We have to adopt the CSDD because businesses have to respect the principles, the rules and the laws that have to apply to everyone. They have to assume their corporate, social and environmental responsibility, because the wrecked lives of people because of forced labor or the toxic chemicals in their bodies far away from our borders are just as important as the lives we want to protect on European soil. When Vanessa or Patience ask us to protect their lands from the ravaging projects of Total in Uganda and that they want a future, then the EU has to act. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Tem agora a palavra.
Thank you. Next speaker, Alexander Vonder. 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, I come from a traditional capitalist school. I think that the purpose of business is to generate profit and not prove what they have achieved all the time, or to show loyalty to the elites and its prevailing ideology. We speak a lot about China, but to be competitive against China, we can't just regulate. Due diligence, as contained in this report, is, I think, crossing the line, and it will hit hard on the SMEs, most of all, companies that everyone here in a very hypocritical way call the backbone of the European economy. Let's make a deal now. Let's show them that we mean what they say about them, and let's reject this stupid and dangerous report.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Manders, 1 minute.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. The CDA supports the proposal of this point of departure of corporate sustainability and due diligence because it's part of our values. And this is something that many colleagues have talked about, establishing a level playing field in Europe. But there's a problem here. It's only a directive. It's a directive that has to be transposed in each member state. You get 27 different systems. That is not a level playing field. So I would call on everybody to support Amendment 423 tomorrow that asks for maximum harmonisation. The point of departure that we stand behind wholeheartedly to help all companies in the EU. I'd ask the Commissioner to support that, to support this idea in the trialogues, and I hope everybody will vote it the right way tomorrow. Another point I'd like to mention, and this is kind of last but not least, I'd like to ask the Commissioner to confirm the situation that small companies, the corner butcher, the football company, the football club round the corner, or the music club should never fall under the obligations of this legislation for reporting. And I think better safe than sorry surely should be our mantra.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Patricia Toya, 1 minute. Thank you, President. It's taken intense months of very difficult negotiations to get this far. Thank you very much to the rapporteur for the work that she's done. She's been very careful. There's been awareness-raising campaigns in favour of corporate due diligence, and all of us need to, in fact, remember what happened in Rana Plaza. We don't want to be hypocrites. We don't want to have shed crocodile tears. We want to be consistent with the UN, the OECD, and their recommendations, and we want to ensure stakeholders are involved all the way down the line. I'm on the industry committee, and I have heard the concerns that the business world has been voicing, but I would recall here that with this provisions we have said we'll provide more assistance to SMEs for their supply chains, or for the costs of audit procedures, so as to ensure that they can cope too. So I am sure that I've done my duty in working on this, and that together with the other colleagues we have come up with the best answers we can to the problems facing us. I think that European industry needs to be ready for this change. Not only is it timely, but it should in fact also open up new opportunities for business along new models, new lines for European companies. Thank you. Thank you very much. Madam Rodriguez Ramos, 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidente. Thank you very much. Voting on the corporate sustainability due diligence is an unprecedented moment. We have binding obligations, and its scope is unprecedented. It's a first around the world. Today I'd like to ask all MEPs to vote in favour of this, but against the amendments. It is a step forward. It's about honesty and consistency. It's to make sure that what the values that we say that we support are in fact something we do support. It's important for the families and their victims affected by Brumadinho, the Rana Plaza collapse, families who are clamouring for the truth and justice. And this law does just that, and make sure that this doesn't happen again. Please vote in favour of it, because most European citizens want this. More than 76% of European citizens want this. Please vote in favour, because most European businesses want this, because most European companies do show due diligence, and we have to make sure that those who don't will do so. We are in favour of defending human rights and the environment. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Sarah Mathieu. 1 minute.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, President. Commissioner. The sweatshops are still going at full throttle, and the victims of these people are the invisible hands who make our cheap clothing. There are millions of workers in the fast fashion industry, above all women, who are working in very precarious environments and for a pittance. This sort of corporate sustainability due diligence law will stop that, will at least deal with the cowboys. This law should make sure that the entire chain will be covered and monitored. There are references to subcontractors and subsidiaries. Wherever abuses are carried out, they'll be uncovered. We, as consumers, have a right to make sure that anything we buy off the rack in a shop has been produced in a fair way. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very much in favour of this law, because in adopting this we are actually producing a fair playing field without competition on the backs of the workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last speaker, Mr. Garcia del Blanco. Good evening. If you read this legislation, SMEs are excluded from the scope, and so people that are worried about this don't have to be, and can vote in favour of this with a clear conscience. If companies have got more than 250 employees, then they'll be affected, not if they've got less. I spoke this morning with someone called Segundo, who's been working for 9 years in a multinational and has been working without any rights for this company. Do we really want to carry on accepting the kind of practices companies are exercising? Child labour. I have to admit, I think I'm better than that, and I think that most European citizens are better than that. And I really do think that there's a tide in the affairs of men, ladies and gentlemen, when we have to listen to our conscience. And so tomorrow, please, this time, listen to your conscience before you vote.
Thank you very much. Now we come to the Catch the Eye procedure. Please stick to the allocated time, 1 minute. I'll begin with Hanna Virkunen.
Kiitos, arvoisa puhemies.
Thank you, President. It is clear that enterprises must act in a responsible way, and each enterprise must be in charge of its own actions. The aim here is good, but the companies have a lot of responsibilities, since they now have to estimate how they work and how all of the value chain works as to the distribution and all of the parts of the chain. They must see what the environmental impacts are, as well as the impacts on human rights. This is a large task. We talked about big multinationals, but now the limit is 250 workers, bigger enterprises than that. However, these obligations will also reach out to the smaller companies, since these value chains include a lot of small companies in distribution, transport, and so on, and we must find out the way they work. So this will cause a lot of burden, both administrative and other, and we should be able to facilitate these companies' position. The financial position also is important. We must estimate that, and we must see to it that this we must take into consideration that this influences the companies a lot, and this is not necessarily the way that they should do it.
Thank you very much. So next speaker, Maria Arena.
Merci, Président.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Up to now, we knew that the world of business was against any law that would impose due diligence. So this is an important step forward if we vote through this law. What are we talking about? We're talking about Total Energy with the ECOP project that destroys the climate. And there are others such as Nike, that is making money out of forced labor, Syngenta, that exports highly toxic substances in Peru, SEAT, leading to deforestation in Southeast Asia. Now, voluntary rules do not work. They just lead to the kind of environmental disasters and human disasters that we're talking about today. So this law has to help us prevent, to minimize, but also to remediate through justice. We're talking about a virtuous circle for our businesses. We have to make sure that our companies carry out positive change and that don't aid and abet all these human rights violations and environmental rules violations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker now, Malte Galle.
Ja, vielen lieben Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Incredibly often I hear on the streets and on the squares, well, what's this got to do with us if in Bangladesh some building collapses, or what's it got to do with us if in Brazil a dam collapses, or what's it to do with us if in Uganda people are dispossessed? Surely the people in those countries should worry about that. These are the people who have to tell, listen, we are living in a globalized world. We have to assume responsibility as to what our companies do around the world, and it's not always pretty. So we now have a huge opportunity to make sure that the rules that we are applying to our companies in the EU on human rights, that they don't just apply here in the EU, that they naturally apply outside the EU, and that strengthens European companies. We should be clear about that. It prevents exploitation, and I would call on all of you to support this proposal. Thank you.
Danke.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Özlem Demirel.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much, President. 2012, 259 people died in a Pakistani textile factory in a fire. They were producing for the German textile company KIK, and then the victims took KIK to the court and the case was thrown out. That is a mockery, and KIK is not the only example of this. Around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, there are multinational companies, Western companies, European companies are exploiting people and exploiting nature brutally. They abuse rules on protecting workers, etc., and they don't bat an eyelid simply because they have no obligation to bear accountability. So, what happens? Well, let's have this voluntary approach. Let us coddle these people so that they do what they ought to do. Mr. Voss, no, it's no longer the time to do that. Let us put our arms around and coddle the workers. Let's coddle the trade unions, the people who are being abused, the people whose rights are being trampled underfoot. So this directive is not a revolution. It is the minimum that needs to be done. And it is, in fact, workers who generate prosperity as well, not just the companies. And I would call on the Conservative colleagues to support this directive and not to work against the interests of the trade unions.
Our next one is Madame Göri.
Dear colleagues, this proposal is another nail in the coffin of European competitiveness. It gives a lot of power to NGOs to blackmail the companies. And companies are held responsible. They need to police one another instead of creating employment and jobs. I'm asking the Commission, how can you achieve 25% reduction in reporting? And where is the famous SME filter, meaning that the Commission never proposes anything that is bad for the SMEs? Last year, almost 150 new proposals came to light that were damaging. And energy prices, inflation, all this difficult situation makes life very tough for SMEs. Companies are able to be fair without rules forced on them. Please, EPP and Liberals, wake up and do not vote for this text tomorrow.
Madame Mónica Silvana González.
Thank you very much, President. We have a responsibility as Europeans because of our reach, and this law on due diligence, together with our trade policy, will help us to avoid corruption in global supply chains and in business relations. But it's also important that we cover SMEs too, and that this legislation should cover all kinds of companies, public and private. We need administrative and civil and criminal liability to be covered. We are now going to fight in trilogue to ensure that this agreement is properly implemented and applied and is included in the Mercosur agreement, for example. This will keep us in the forefront of human rights struggles and sustainability struggles throughout the world. Please don't support the amendments. Please support the original text, which has been agreed upon by all of the committees together. Thank you.
Monsieur Kostas Papadakis.
The directive is there to protect monopolies. The EU is helping business circles and is making sure that it doesn't have to pay for the fact that it is striving for maximum profits, making life misery for its workers. It's all about pillaging the environment. The capitalist state, backed by the directive, means that it's the businesses that will check themselves, will monitor themselves. How can that be? They will be holding themselves accountable or not, and they will even be able to get some kind of certificate showing they respect human rights to be able to show that they have an edge over their competitors and that they are better. The directive says that it's business directors that are responsible for auditing their own. I mean, you're having us on. In Greece, it's only the workers and the people that can do something about this and give an answer to you, and showing that it's either their profits or our lives, and they can only do so by voting for a stronger Communist Party.
Our colleague Maria Manuel Leiter Marques.
When I was small, in the days of my grandparents, there was a black, polluted river near us that we didn't even dare touch. Now, everything was in fact excused because of the companies that were providing jobs for the region. Now things have changed. We know that many companies are actively working for sustainability and that our citizens actually very much value that. This directive is going to ensure that we do better in the future so that we don't have to always provide remedies for things that have been destroyed, so that in fact we don't carry on accepting intolerable practices. This is something that we want for the future, for any future. Thank you.
That brings the Catch the Eye procedure to a close. I'd now like to give the floor to Commissioner Reinders.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for all your comments and remarks. You know that we have an ambitious agenda on sustainability. This initiative was unveiled 7 years after the Rana Plaza tragedy, and through this initiative we'll be able to implement our social commitments, environmental commitments and human rights commitments through corporate governance. The European Commission has followed both an ambitious approach and a proportionate one. In its proposal for a directive, SMEs are excluded. I'm very happy to see that I have broad support in this Parliament in order to avoid fragmentation through different national legislation and in order to have a fair and more sustainable economy. Of course, I'll be thrilled to embark on the trilogues before the summer, if possible. As you know, this file is one of the key priorities during my term, and I can assure you that I'm very committed to this going through. Thank you very much.
Madame Rapporteur Wolters, the floor is yours.
Thank you, colleagues, for this debate. Thank you to all those who participated, and it's great to see the support expressed by so many colleagues here today, and I hope that this backing will transform into a substantial majority tomorrow. At the same time, let me address some of the criticism expressed here today. I hear that due diligence will affect Europe's competitiveness, but the very core of this law is a level playing field between EU and non-EU companies. I've heard also that this would be a disproportionate burden for companies, but that overlooks the reality of what we're proposing here. We don't ask companies to go and fight every problem on this planet. We allow them to prioritise actions that are relevant to them and to the risks that they face. We're aware of the importance of industry collaboration in different sectors, and we're preventing heavy contractual obligations for SMEs. Meneer Manders, die kan ik ook geruststellen.
I'd like to reassure people that there's the local butcher or the football club, unless it is registered as having 250 employees and having a turnover of 40 million euros, it'll be free of problems.
23. Not only are companies able to rise to the challenge of due diligence in the future, they are already doing it. Aldi, IKEA, Unilever, ASOS, Mars, Ericsson, those are just some of the companies calling for human rights and environmental standards that give more clarity on what we mean by responsible business. They are joined by prominent trade associations in the financial, pharmaceutical and technology sectors, to name a few. Those who are now seeking to frustrate this law are siding with a minority of political and commercial interests, and they are electioneering. To my colleagues who need to vote tomorrow, I want to say, if you're on the side of millions of citizens who want to see change, as well as the businesses and civil society that are pleading for that, if you're on the side of responsibility and a Europe fit to lead on the big questions of our time, then show that tomorrow. Reject the amendments, back this compromise, and let us go to trilogues. And last, but definitely not least, I want to very warmly thank the Commissioner for his leadership in this, all of my colleagues who have worked so constructively with me on this and who have been so involved, and my own team, Matthew Hogarth and Helene Beag, whose very last working day in the European Parliament is tomorrow, and without whose help this would not have been possible. So thank you so much to all.
Thank you, Madam. Die Aussprache ist damit.
That concludes this debate. The vote will take place tomorrow. That brings us on to the next item on our agenda. Council and Commission statements on breaches of the rule of law and fundamental rights in Hungary and frozen EU funds. And on behalf of the Council, I'd like to ask Mr. Peter Kullgren to take the floor.